Jocelyn.
And I'm Danny.
And this is Why Can't We Talk About It? And in today's episode, Danny and I are going to cover body image. Now, this is a fairly major topic. I think it's something that all of us can relate to. We all have bodies. We all feel certain types of way about them. And they really shape our experience and how we move through the world. So I'm feeling a little bit nervous because sharing personal vulnerabilities about how I see myself and how I see my physical body is not something that I do very regularly. That might be surprising because I share, I'm pretty much an open book, but body image is not something that I have regular conversations with anyone about, except maybe in therapy. So I think for me, I'm nervous about this one because I will probably be shedding some light on things I've never talked to even my close friends and family about. But I think it's important because the reason why we started this podcast is to share things that other people can relate to. And I hope that we cover a lot of that in this episode.
Yeah, I think this is actually going to be a very interesting episode because body image is something that I know I've never really talked about with anyone. I want to say it came up maybe a couple times in therapy just as like a venting session about what that is, but I don't think it's ever anything that I've ever talked about really with anyone. I can just thinking off the top of my head, obviously not with family. And I can't remember even talking about it with friends. And I think it's going to be a very interesting topic because, of course, Jocelyn and I, we got man and woman talking on the podcast and just talking about different experiences. It's actually going to be very interesting to hear because I don't really think I even had that conversation with my partner, my girlfriend, I think. I don't think that's even really a topic we even really kind of go into. So I think today, going into this a bit, just sharing our experiences, sharing a bit of the vulnerabilities, I think it'll be very interesting to hear because even Jocelyn and myself, we've never come across this topic in our conversations. So this alone will be actually uncharted territory. So let's see what we, come up with.
Let's dive in. Okay, so I mentioned that I talked about body image in therapy. I will preface this by saying that I am in a fairly good spot when it comes to self-confidence and body image, and it took a long time to get here, over 2 decades to get to this spot. And it was only in the last couple of years that I really feel like I can say that. So I'm comfortable having this conversation because I've processed a lot of the things that we're going to talk about. But yeah, when I started my therapy journey, I think what helped is I got to the root of why it was such an insidious issue for me. Body image is huge for women, period. Women and men, but body image issues, I don't know one woman in my life who doesn't think about it on a daily basis. It's it's such a huge part of our lives, right? But for me, I felt that body image was in my therapy journey and in my self-development. Letting go of negative body image was the hardest thing for me. It was harder than working through anxiety and depression. That's how big of a challenge this was to me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And to understand why that was, we sort of explored why was having a certain body image such a high value for me? Why did I place that so as something with such importance in my life? And I think it goes back to some of my earliest memories when I was just a little girl. Sort of my role, or at least the message that I really internalized around my family, was that being pretty and being beautiful was very important. It was like the best thing that I could be. It was praise. And it was probably like the only praise I really remember getting from a really young age. In Chinese, what all of my aunties and like the older generation, whenever I would greet them, they wouldn't call me by my name. They would call me Liang Moi, which in Hakka means beautiful girl, like pretty girl.
Okay, yeah.
And it just stuck so deep. Being like that it felt like part of my identity was like, you are the pretty one. And I think that is why I have placed such a like huge weight on myself to maintain a certain type of image, because from a really young age, I wasn't necessarily told like, oh my gosh, you're so funny. I was told I was smart. Listen, I had a tiger mom. It was all A's. It was A's or nothing, bitch. You know, it was like, listen, I think I got a B one time, probably in like gym or something, and my mom called the school to be like, what is my daughter doing wrong?
Yeah.
How can she improve? It was that. But more than that, like from an earlier age, like from being like 3 years old, 4 years old, before scholarly pursuits were ever in the picture, it was always like praise for being beautiful, not like, oh, you're so brave, or, you know, any of the number of things that we can tell little girls that they are. So that was like first, you know, core memory setting in. And
that was around 3? Like your earliest memory is 3?
Those were like my earliest memories, but that continued like right up until puberty, for sure. Yeah, that was like...
Okay, but it started at 3.
Mm-hmm.
That's very young.
Yes.
And also a very impressionable time, too.
Super impressionable.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. Sorry, go on.
So, growing up with Asian cousins who had traditionally like very slender builds, I felt compared to them a lot. And I understand Hakka. It was my first language. I don't speak it anymore. But I think sometimes certain family members forgot that I could understand, or maybe they just didn't give a shit. But I could hear them comparing me to my cousins, sometimes even my mom. Like when they would compare me to my mom, it wasn't in necessarily like a cruel way, but it was more like, oh, she's definitely not built like her mom, or she takes after her dad's side of the family for sure. Like insinuating that I am much bigger than my mom.
Yeah.
So hearing that was, oh my gosh, it happened at the worst time. It happened when I hit puberty, and that's around the same age that, you know, I started watching music videos and reading magazines, and all of the messaging that was shoved down my throat that showed me, oh my gosh, particularly in the early 2000s, where we were just riding out heroin chic and getting into the age of like just, oh my gosh, ultra thin being the most desirable. And I have memories of certain pop stars and certain actresses that I think are seared on my brain. Like, for instance, watching Britney Spears performing with a boa constrictor wrapped around her shoulders in a crop top with her fucking abs.
Yeah.
We all do.
We all remember that, yeah.
For me, that was like, oh my gosh, my body's never going to look like that. Or Christina Aguilera in Dirty with her like the most low waist mini skirt she probably needed to get a Brazilian wax just to wear that mini skirt. And her abs being like, again, on point. I was like, okay, that's what I need to look like. It was also the era of Victoria's Secret angels, and my mom got the Victoria's Secret catalog. So every month that would come in, and every month I would look at Adriana Lima and be like, wow, if I could only lose 15 pounds so that I could look the way she looks. And it was such a weird time because I never shared that I felt a certain way about my body image. It wasn't like my friends and I weren't the type that were always on crash diets or like sharing that we wanted to lose weight to fit into a smaller size or a certain dress or something. It wasn't something that we talked about like that. I kind of like just I just sort of faked it that I felt fine about my body. I think I probably made comments like, oh, I wish I could lose a few pounds before I wear a bikini this summer. But it was just like an ever-present thing that I just always wanted to be thinner. And when I was going through puberty, when I was this age, when I was a teenager, I look back at pictures of myself and there was no weight to lose. It was so crazy. Like I look back at pictures of myself in certain outfits and I remember the feeling on that day. Like I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm so self-conscious. I hope nobody is looking at my stomach right now. And I look at pictures from that day now as a healthy adult and I'm like, you were so delusional. I probably had a touch of body dysmorphia for sure. I am also like purposely not sharing my height or my weight because I don't want that to be triggering for anybody. But I will say that since then, I've definitely put on more weight, like as I've grown older. And the weight that I was then, I just can't believe that I thought that I could lose 10 pounds. But literally from the age of 14, probably 13, 14, to my mid-20s, I always wanted to lose 10 pounds.
Yeah. Wow.
And the only reason that stopped is because, number one, I talked about it in therapy. And also, I have to say, it wasn't therapy that really helped me get over it. It was a couple years ago after my wedding where I was so fit. I looked so good. And I was like, to look like this for the rest of my life, I'm going to have to always watch what I eat and have a strict workout plan like a maniac. Because I was so conscious of what I was eating. I would, like, if I went to restaurants, I would order salads. And that is so not how I wanted to live my life. And I think I just woke up one day and I was like, I'm almost 30, or I'm 30. I have a long road ahead of me, and I don't want to keep going this way. It's just not the most fulfilling way I could live. And it was that simple switch where I kind of just realized, do I really want to keep losing 10 pounds for the rest of my life? And I realized that I didn't. I really didn't. And as soon as I switched that mindset and started doing exercises that I actually enjoyed and eating in a way that I wanted, it sounds so simple. It took me so long to realize it, but oh my gosh, it's the only thing that's really helped me reach like self-acceptance, which I've been working on turning into self-confidence.
Right. Is that, I mean, there's a lot there already, but I kind of wanted to I'm curious about the fact about how, you're saying that from when you were 3 up until a teen, that I understand that for a lot of it is like how you think of yourself, but obviously it didn't necessarily start that way. It was external people making comments and stuff like that. However, it sounds like from you said so far, though, it was more like family. Was there beyond that? Or is it more like just a combination of family and like you said, getting like the magazines, the what you see on TV. Is it that, or were there more? I guess is my question.
You can tell that this is like a topic that I haven't explored and like fully talked about, because I kind of just did like the whole journey from 3 years old to where I am now in like 10 minutes with,
Yeah.
like, and like glossed over the hardest parts. When I was in my teens, that's where I really felt like my body was not mine. My body was there for everybody else. And what I mean by that is, oh my gosh. Okay, let's just get into it. So from the first time that boys and men started to become interested in me, I was just fed a narrative of you're hot and this is what I think of your body. Like I was constantly told by guys, even if it wasn't somebody I was dating, mostly guys I wasn't dating. I didn't really date a lot, to be honest. But boys just felt like they could comment on what I look like. And it wasn't just compliments, and it wasn't just like, about my weight necessarily. It was really specific. Like when I went through puberty, I developed pretty early. So I went from like nothing to like a C cup overnight. And guys would comment on that relentlessly, whether it was good or bad. I have a few things seared in my memory. I had one guy tell me that I was the first girl he knew that would have liposuction on my breasts and have it injected into my ass because my ass wasn't big enough, but my tits were. I had more than one guy ask me what my nipples looked like, what color they were, since I'm mixed. Yeah, this is like
wow.
In school. Like guys just felt like they could make comments like this on my body. It wasn't every day, but it was enough that I understood that my body, it was my body first. That was it. Like that was how I was going to move through the world, is that people were going to see my body. And it took so much to change that. I fought that so much. Like I think like the best compliment you could give me is that I'm a caring person. I'm a creative person. I'm funny. I tell Azim all the time that I'm the funniest person that I know. That matters so much more to me than what I look like. But
yeah,
that wasn't what I was. That wasn't how I grew up. My body felt for so long like it was everybody else's. And because it was just so normalized, like when these guys said these things to me, it didn't seem abnormal. That's what's crazy. It didn't seem like,
yeah.
Like now, if anybody even like remotely made a comment like that to me or to like my 14-year-old cousin, I'd have to be phoning you from jail, Danny. Like that's just the unfortunate situation.
Yeah.
But at the time, people talked about my body so much that it was just like, just add it to the list. Whether it was, I just shared with you some like pretty graphic and negative comments, but good comments too, right? I was just so sick of hearing about what I looked like, but I also couldn't escape it, right? I also like, it wasn't like I could just hide my body and go through life. Like, I think if remote school and like all of that stuff was a thing back then, I don't know that I don't know what I would have done. I think I may have just like hidden from the world, but I couldn't just take my body off display. I really had to learn how to come to terms with it and get to a place where I could take back ownership of my body and my body image and get to a place where it didn't matter what other people thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I just sometimes think about how, that's you, right? That's one example. That's one person. Just the amount of comments that there are out there for, towards women, girls, younger age. I was watching, it's reminded me of, I was watching one of those podcasts, and have you ever heard of the show Smallville?
Yeah.
Okay, so the girl, Kristen Crook, I think is the actress's name. She was talking about how when she was younger, and how the comments and just the way men kind of like spoke to her in a like openly, the way that you described it. And at first it was like, she was saying how like, that's really bad. And I remember just saying like, yeah, that is pretty bad. And then she added on the fact that like, yeah, I was 15. And it seemed like the younger that she was, the more she got those kind of comments from people who were like much older, 30s, 40s probably, is how she kind of described it. And I just remember thinking like, man, that's messed up. That's messed up. And it must be just so tiring, I imagine, to get that, especially from just when you don't want it, or to be, I always imagine that's that feeling of being reduced down to just your looks, when for most people, it's like you can't really control, like that's who you are. But then to get comments of, oh, you can do this about it, you can do that about it, unwanted comments, it just must be so, I guess, distressing, is my guess.
Yeah.
To get that. Because, even your story so far, it's just like, it's already difficult enough it is having that in your own head. Then to have people add that all on, like, it just must do so much to anyone who goes
Yeah, it
through
was
that.
almost like confirmation, as much as I want to fight against my identity being tied up with the way that I looked, so much of my formative years was just other people confirming that, And the reason why I wanted to disclose that the way I look is, by today's standards, like conventionally attractive, is because I wanted to point out that, that's me experiencing that. What about the girls that maybe didn't fit into that? What I see so many TikToks and Instagram posts from women who grew up the same time I did, who also had a horrible time because they didn't fit that ideal stereotype, and they were farther from it than I was. And the comments that they received were cruel as well. So that's kind of why I wanted to point that out. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important. I mean, so far, I think, a lot of it, it's like the vulnerability it takes to kind of bring that up, kind of explain it, and then also kind of like share some of that. Hearing the comments that you got from the guys in high school.
That's literally just two, Danny. That's just two.
And that's just two. And you're right, yeah. And that's just like two examples, right? So it's like, how many of those are, being said to people? And, especially when like social media talks about it, I see it. I see people talk about their experiences, and it's not, a lot of times it's not just verbal comments. There are, people who feel like they have physical access to someone else. It could be strangers, it could be someone they know, but the person who's doing it just feels like, hey, I can, just because I can.
Well, I'm gonna blame the patriarchy for that, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. But I mean, it does, I like to think it comes from somewhere. But the point is, it's a lot, right? So thank you for sharing that piece, because that's hard. And that's probably something I imagine too. It's like something that people just kind of walk around thinking about too. So to, speak about it on a podcast, to share with people, I think it sucks to hear, but it's important, I think, that the more people hear about it, that it becomes something that people understand, like, hey, it's not just yourself going through that. So thank you for sharing that piece.
Yeah, I'm like, after talking about it, I haven't thought about that particular situation in a long time, and I can't help but look back at baby me, 16-year-old me, and like I'm just so proud of how far I've come because oh man, there's so much going on. You couldn't pay me to be a teenager again. But it
is rough.
It's a rough time.
And we didn't have social media back then.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? No, I'm so thankful that we didn't have Instagram and TikTok back then.
Yeah, like I already, my outlets for having an image in that sense about like through media is basically magazines and TV and movies. That's it. And that was enough to make a huge dent in what I thought, how people were supposed to look like. And I imagine now you add on every single kind of social media that people can kind of throw at you. Plus you can go search for all that stuff and the amount of information that's out there that's like not helpful. Man, that must be so rough. I feel like that's
an episode in itself,
for
breaking down
now.
Like the effect of social media and filters and unrealistic body expectations and the Kardashians. That could be a whole episode.
Oh, yeah.
But going back to what you mentioned, like you said, growing up with magazines and movies had an impact on you. So I want to hear what it was like from the perspective of a young Danny.
Yeah, so for young Danny, it was actually, I want to say, different in terms of what body image meant and just kind of where all that stuff comes from. Because when I think about it, when I think about, I guess just even the concept of body image, it definitely wasn't anything that I remember getting as a young child. I don't remember getting that kind of comment being like, I guess like for you to say like, oh, family members calling you, pretty girl or things like that, which reinforces an idea in you. I never really got that when it came to the body. I actually don't even think I even got any of that from my family until much later. Like when I think about my past and having to do with anything to do with the idea of like, hey, what does my body look like? It wasn't really a thing until like my earliest memory is grade 8, so grade 8, that is, I think I was 12, 13 years old.
Yeah, like 12, 13.
Yeah. And I remember it was at a point where from what I remember, there was some kind of like semi-formal or dance where we had to like get fancy clothes for the first time. And I remember just thinking like, oh, I want to look nice. But I remember getting new pants, and not that I was, really thinking about the body, but I remember just for context in terms of like people understanding, I actually am going to say like my measurements that I can remember just to give context. So Danny's in grade 8. He's getting new pants. I remember someone making a comment like, oh, what size waist are you getting for your pants? And I remember saying, oh, it's a 30-inch waist. I also remember that was also the same year we did like some school, I don't know, skating or skiing. I think they need the measurements for weight. And then I remember I weighed myself and I remember being 115. So 115 pounds, 30-inch waist, and I was 5'7". So as far as I can tell, I would say very thin. And I think it was around that time too when comments were starting to come through family-wise, just being like, "Oh, you're Danny, you're so thin. Eat more." Right? So opposite, I think, of what you were dealing with in terms of this idea that you have to like lose weight. And it was around that time when the idea of like, oh, maybe I am kind of skinny. Maybe I should try to like eat more or gain weight or, anything else. And so that transitioned into high school. And that's when around the time that I remember the internet kind of became a thing. And I remember things like, being more independent or going shopping and seeing things like, I think the biggest thing that stuck out to me, Abercrombie and Fitch, and the way, they used, of course, their models and especially the male models. And that was when the concept of a 6-pack came into my head. And I was like, I want a six pack, but without even knowing like how that even works, right? Like I think at one point I thought it was like, oh, you just got to be less fat, but keep in mind how skinny I was. And so I remember that was then kind of like, the age of internet, the age of that kind of marketing. And so seeing the bodies of people out there, and I guess in my mind, it was basically what is desirable is six packs and muscles. So you want to be muscular and you want to make sure you got a six pack. And so that I think was when that whole genesis of me being like, oh, I need to look differently. I need to be different than I am now. And that's when I remember joining a gym with some friends. I remember one of my friends were both on like the thin sides. We're both trying to like, how can we gain weight so we can like work out and get muscular? And we would do things like, I remember getting a lot of like protein shakes. I remember getting, they even had shakes specifically for gaining weight. So I had weight gainers. So gross. But I remember doing that. Just mixing it with like plain water. So gross. Yeah, it's yeah. But then also at the same time, I was like very conscious of like being fat. So, with limited information at the time, I bought into this idea that like eating fat equals getting fat.
Right.
So I would do things like, oh, if I'm having eggs, I don't want the egg yolk. I'll get rid of it. I remember my family would have milk in the fridge, and I'd be like, hey, we should like get skim milk. It's better for you. And so then I would get a skim milk, and it just tastes like watered down milk, gross. Which is again so gross. But I thought that's what was required, right? Because there was this image of me where I'm like, I need to get to a certain point to look better, for the purposes of being looked at by people who be like, oh, he looks nice, he looks good. And that was important because I, of course, didn't see anybody else looking like me, right? Media-wise. And it probably didn't help that all the media that I see in the TV, movies, and magazines were actually non-Asian people.
Right. Throw that in.
So even back then, there's like no one, there was no idea in my head what it says, hey, Danny, even if you did everything that you're supposed to, you still won't look like them. You're going to look like whatever you look like, in the best shape that you can, but you'll never look like those people. And that concept never really crossed my mind. And so a lot of that came from, again, I guess the original was like, just some comments from family. But then I think as I kind of explored through the media, and that was how I kind of saw more. It's like, oh, I want to do more. What else can I do? I guess, when we talk about weight, though, of course, that kind of stayed with me for a long time. And all through like high school, all through university. And then once I started working, though, that kind of changed where, the lifestyle changed. Office work, sit a lot. I didn't really work out that much anymore. And so as time passed, I started gaining weight. And then the messaging kind of changed, right? It's like, oh, Danny, you need to lose some weight. I think you're getting a bit big. And that was, again, back to family. And I guess for me, it's like, I can kind of see like the caring portion from it, but at the same time, it wasn't really helpful. I don't think it was necessarily said in a way where it's like helpful for me. It's just like, hey, you're getting big. It's like, okay, well, what do you want me to do about it? So it was comments like that. And I remember thinking like, okay, so if I'm too thin, you're going to say something about it. That's a problem. But then once I get kind of big, it's also a problem. Where's the correct part to be? And it's not like I got comments being like, hey, you're in this ideal spot, just stay here. So it's almost like you can't win in that regard, when I think about it like that. However, I would definitely say, like, I guess this is for comparison's sake, but, when I compare it to hearing what you just said, I'm like, well, I guess it wasn't like as bad.
Well, we shouldn't do that.
But at the same time,
I think, no.
Yeah, we shouldn't do that. Yeah, okay. So, with body image, though, I have to say it's, I think this part was just about weight, but I also do want to say that, like, during high school, I went through a phase where acne was a thing, dealing with that, where, like, I have to say, when I think about it, I don't really remember externally, like, my peers ever saying anything, because I guess my peers were also kind of going through that. Like, people like in high school were, getting acne, or I know people who they got braces at the time. So I remember whoever had it was very self-conscious about that. But I think we all kind of were peers, so it was okay. But for me, I think there was, again, more comments coming from my mom.
Okay.
As an example. And it's a bit of a struggle when I think about that part of my life, where having acne and having my mom kind of make comments, not necessarily in a rude way, but I remember when I had acne, she was very big on trying to figure out a way to get rid of them for me. And I recall her saying it through this way where she's trying to help me. But I kind of also remember there were times where I was like, oh, man, like, can you just kind of let it go for a little bit? Because it felt like a constant thing where she was trying to help me. It's like, oh, here's some medication. Oh, let's take you to the doctor. There's things for that. Oh, we can try, if Western medication doesn't work, we can try Eastern medication, Eastern doctors. Or I remember there was different kinds of advertisements for acne. I'm trying to remember what that brand was. It was a really big brand. Even the guy from Maroon 5, I think he was a spokesman for that. Yeah.
That sounds right. Proactive.
Is it Proactive?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, so much Proactive. I used so much of those. And that was a phase, but I was like, it was definitely something where maybe I sometimes wonder how much of like someone trying to help me get rid of it made me more self-conscious of it.
Yeah, you're internalizing, you're internalizing that there is something wrong with you. Yeah.
It's like the more it's like, hey, let me help you get rid of it. I'm like, oh, well, that means that's even worse than what it is. So, that's it's for me, I find it's a tricky one to look back on that and go, was that really helpful, or would I have been better off if my mom wasn't so on that? But again, that's just an additional thing to when I think about body image. For me, it's like, there's the home stuff that you get from people from within the home, the family, and there's the media. And it's not always just about weight. I know weight is a big one, but the fact that you got celebrity endorsements for acne products and so forth, it's a big deal, and something that I know that I dealt with a lot. Between the weight thing and the acne thing, when I think about those times in my life, I would definitely say, like, having acne actually was way worse than dealing with weight. I'm not sure why exactly, but I do remember just being way more sad during that period versus just dealing with the in and outs of whether it's, oh, I'm too thin and too light, or now I'm a bit too big and on the heavier side. But it was like, for me, I think acne was actually like in this conversation topic of body image, much worse when it was happening. However, today, I would say that, yeah, you know what, weight is still a struggle. I've, have attempted to do different things. Like, I've done dieting, I've done keto, I've done paleo, I've done intermittent fasting. I tried Zone. What else have I tried? All I know is they all just like, man, this sucks. It's not fun to do, for sure. And sometimes even like because it's unsustainable.
Well,
for me personally,
not dieting doesn't work. It's not sustainable.
Yeah, it makes me go like, oh, how are these people doing it? How are they able to? Why can't I? There's something wrong with me. And that's that internal dialogue that I have with myself. Sometimes that's more of a struggle than just anything that a comment will come from somebody else. I think it's the internal dialogue that actually kind of just makes it worse. So I know that that is something that I kind of still struggle with. I don't know if I'll necessarily get over that anytime soon, but it's something that I am working on. But it is definitely a thing.
It's something.
So that's kind of my story.
It's something that you're still working through and processing. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge. And I know that I've said that I have good self-confidence now. That's not to say that I'm cured or whatever. Like, I definitely have my days. Not every single day is perfect. I was actually having a conversation with one of my girlfriends on the phone the other day, and it was just like a particularly bad day. I was PMSing, which that's another thing, right? Just like being a woman, when your body fluctuates so much throughout the month, like that's tough in itself. But I was having a bad body image day, and I was talking to a girlfriend, and she was commiserating and saying the same thing, and that she was going to start working out again. And yeah, on that day, I was like, oh, this is such a setback. Like, I hate that I'm spending time thinking about this. And then, it took a couple days. I want to share some things besides therapy and besides just changing my mindset that have helped. So when I do have days like that, there are a few like podcasts and content creators that I watch that actually like sort of do a reset for me and remind me that I'm great just the way I am. Mm-hmm. So, we mentioned before that social media is pretty toxic. There is another side to that where there are platforms now, and there are so many people and many women who don't fit into like traditional beauty standards, who are maybe in bigger bodies, or like you mentioned, Danny, like they have acne, or maybe they have other skin conditions, like vitiligo or alopecia. Like, there's a lot of things that go into body image, and they share their journeys, and they share their confidence. And it's just such a great reminder for me. I also really like this podcast called Diet Starts Tomorrow, where it focuses on just this topic. It's literally a podcast that focuses on body image, and they have episodes. They have like a little 4-part series on the stuff that we as millennials grew up with that fucked up our body image. I think one of them does mention the Britney Spears boa constrictor dance. There's also there's other ones. Oh my gosh, there's so many. I actually loved listening to them because I was like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one who had that image of Hilary Duff in that crop top seared into my brain. It was like the thing that I was trying to look at. They cover that, and much like we hope to do with our podcast, it's just, being able to say, okay, I'm not the only one who feels this way, and to see the hosts who are amazing, strong women who have gone through it and come out the other side is, again, a good reminder for me of how far I've come, and that this isn't something that I need to take up time thinking about every day.
I do think that, what you just said regarding people sharing their, what other people look like, and just sharing those things out there, the more people see it, I think to help normalize that, it is a big deal, and it's very helpful. One thing that I like, this one just more for me personally, is because so much of the influences came from movies and magazines. There's definitely certain people in I guess Hollywood world where they're known for their bodies. So for example, I'm going to throw in Channing Tatum. I'm going to throw in Zac Efron, Chris Hemsworth, big one of course right now, being Thor, for movies. Or even someone like, I remember this comment that I made to Andrea one time where I was looking at some interview. It was, who's the guy again who plays Superman?
Henry
Cavill, right? Yeah, okay. So I remember there was one time, around the time when he was first out as Superman, and there's an interview with him talking about what he does, what is important to work out, important for diet, important to sleep. And the article mentioned his statistics of his height and weight, which I think at the time when it was like maybe like 5'10", 195 pounds. I think that's in the article somewhere. And I remember thinking, we're the same height or weight, but what do you think it like? I was like, oh, are you kidding me? I didn't know how tall he was. I didn't know how much he weighed. But once that article came out, I was like, oh, we're the same. just visually completely different people. And I wasn't like upset or, sad or anything. I just found it hilarious that it's such a discrepancy of understanding what is actually happening like in movies and stuff. And, when I mentioned those people, Andrea shared an article the other day. I think it was from, it was BuzzFeed, I think. But anyways, it was more like just male actors who basically talk about how like what they did to get in shape for those movies is actually like they did not. It was not enjoyable.
No, definitely not.
So it wasn't. I remember watching one interview with Zac Efron. He did Baywatch, and I remember him saying basically that he's like all he did was work out. So people didn't even really like be hanging around him anymore because all he could talk about was working out. And he said him getting into that great of a shape made him realize he does not want to be in that great of a shape. But it's those kind of stories where I think we as the public and the consumers rarely hear about because I don't think that part is advertised. And so we see these movies, we see these bodies on the screen, but we don't know anything about how it got there. And once it's in a movie, once it's in a picture, I think the default thinking process is like, oh, look at that. They must look like that all the time. And so you're like, I want to be like that. But realistically, they're not like that all the time. It's for like a short time frame. And then that's it. But we don't see that. Or at least I know I don't. So I think the thinking process doesn't really, kind of catch on when I see a picture or on a movie that like, hey, they're not like this all the time. So trying to achieve that and make it be like a daily thing actually isn't really attainable and not healthy. But that discussion doesn't really happen, I don't think, often enough, at least.
It's a great point.
So
if you combine that with the conversation around airbrushing, we grew up with so much airbrushing that wasn't disclosed. I think Cindy Crawford said that something like, I don't even look like Cindy Crawford. She was like, referring to like how much images get retouched. And in modern day times, like you mentioned the unsustainable workout regimens that aren't, widely talked about. It's also like, again, I'm going to reference the Kardashians and their surgically perfect bodies, right? I think it's like pretty common knowledge that they don't look that way. Like that's not how they came out of Kris Jenner. They've attained these bodies and faces with a little help. But I'm not on social media that often, so I don't think that they've like disclosed all the different surgeries they've had. But, we know that they've had them. But without them...
I believe they've denied it too.
Oh, they deny it? Yeah, so...
I think they kind of deny it.
Yeah, so, and like a lot of models have denied having like anything done. And I think that that's such a harmful narrative, right? Because like to your point, we don't see that. So like it's kind of pushed on us that like this is what like the ultimate most beautiful man or woman looks like. And then we feel like shit because like we could never look like that. But little do we know what goes on behind the scenes for them to achieve that unrealistic standard.
Yeah. There's a lot that goes into it. So, but
I have so much more I could talk about. I think there are some things, maybe we'll do a part 2 if in the future, if listeners want that. I think Like there are other things that have helped me on my journey besides listening to podcasts, going to therapy, and certain content creators. Like I think like a big part of my journey to taking back my body was through fashion. Like I think like Danny, you know, we work together, so you know the what I wear, my wardrobe. That was such a huge part of me reclaiming my image. I'd love to dive into that if listeners are interested. So maybe we'll leave it at that. Maybe if our listeners want to shoot us an email or a message and say like this topic resonated and they want us to talk about it, totally open to that. This or anything else that we've talked about so far, or maybe other episode ideas. I think it's great for us to get feedback. So yeah, it's a good place to end it. And thank you, Danny, for sharing as well. I found it super interesting to get your perspective as a man, you know, growing up as a young boy at the same time I did. And also hearing that, you know, this is something that you still struggle with. It's something that's ongoing. I think it's brave of you to share that. So thanks for opening up and being so vulnerable with your experiences.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think same for you too. There's it is nice to hear that there is the process where it gets better. So to hear that from you actually was really nice. But at the same time, when I hear what you said about growing up, the comments, the high school comments, it's sad to hear. Just kind of hearing that, just be like, the stuff that people have to go through, what you have to go through, you know, it's definitely not something that I can say I went through the same thing, but just hearing it and knowing that it happened, it does suck. So I can't imagine it's something where, you know, talking about it again or bringing it back up isn't always that easy. So for you to do that, you know, for you as well, thank you for being able to share.
Yeah, I'm proud of myself. I'm glad we did this.
So I was going to say that we haven't mentioned it in previous episodes, but we have an Instagram account now.
We're back on the gram.
Right?
At
this point, I think we can say that.
I started out the podcast being like, I'm not on socials. I'm technically not. I actually have, I have the app completely separate. It's not even on my homepage. I'm doing it solely for our podcast and to share the podcast in a way that's accessible for our listeners, because I think most people are on Instagram. So that's a good plug, Danny. Yeah, you guys can follow us at Why Can't We Podcast.
Right. And then that is correct. And I believe that is the newest thing. You know, as usual, there are going to be items in the show notes for Jocelyn's blog. Definitely plugging that. And then I think for that's kind of it for now. We will definitely be back next week for another interesting topic that I hope that listeners will enjoy. And I think we are going to enjoy talking about as well.
Thanks so much for listening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.